Hi friends, and welcome back to our cozy corner of the world. Whether you're curled up with a warm cup of tea, sitting on the porch as the sun goes down, or just looking for a little peace in your day, this story is just for you. It's called Walking into the Past, and it's a gentle, heartwarming tale that invites you to slow down, breathe, and wander through something a little magical. It's made for everyone young, old, or somewhere in between. So come along. Let's take a walk together. In a quiet village tucked between green hills and sleepy streams, there stood a cottage with ivy curling over its stone walls like gentle fingers. The roof was mossy, the windows round and always glowing warmly from within, and in the back garden past the raspberry bushes and the rosemary patch, there was an old wooden door set into the hillside. No one had opened that door in years. The cottage belonged to Nora, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair that fell in soft waves down her back. She lived alone, though she never felt lonely. Her days were filled with tending to her herb garden, knitting by the fire, and feeding the little robins that came tapping at her kitchen window. Every morning, she would whisper good morning to the garden, and every evening, she would light a lantern on her porch, just in case someone ever needed a soft light in the dark. Nora had lived in the cottage since she was a girl. The garden, the creaky floorboards, the rose-printed teacups, all of it had grown with her. But the door in the hillside? That had always been a mystery. Her grandmother used to tell stories about it, stories of old times and forgotten places. "It's a door for memories," she would say, tapping the side of her nose with a wink. "But it only opens when the heart is ready." Nora never asked what that meant. She liked the mystery. Still, sometimes, when the wind rustled the ivy just right, or a songbird sang a tune she hadn't heard in years, she would find herself standing in front of that door, key in hand. Though she had never known where the key came from, it had simply always been there, nestled in a carved wooden bowl beside the fireplace. One crisp autumn afternoon, Nora was raking golden leaves into neat piles when she felt something shift not in the air, but in her chest, a soft pull, like a thread tugging her gently toward the hill. She followed it without thinking, leaves crackling under her boots, her breath visible in the cool air. The ivy moved softly, almost as if parting to greet her, and there it was, the old door, waiting. This time, she didn't hesitate. She slid the key into the lock, and slowly, gently, the door creaked open. Behind the door was not a room, but a path narrow, mossy, and lined with old stone lanterns. They flickered to life as she passed, their glow soft and golden. The air smelled faintly of honey and lavender, and everything felt still, but not empty, like the world was holding its breath in the gentlest way. As she walked, Nora noticed something strange. The trees she passed looked familiar, too familiar. One had a heart carved into its bark, the letters N, Jiawon, M, faded but clear. She remembered doing that as a teenager, giggling with her best friend May under a full moon. They had sworn to stay young forever. A few steps later, Nora saw a wooden swing hanging from an old oak. The rope was frayed in the same way it had been when she was 8 years old. Her little hands had clutched that rope tightly as her grandfather pushed her, his deep laugh filling the garden air. She turned slowly in place. This wasn't just any path. This was her past. Somehow, the door hadn't led her into a different world. It had gently walked her into her own memories, stitched together into a quiet, living garden. Everything was here. Her childhood daisy patch, her mother's kitchen window with lace curtains, even the tiny frog pond where she'd once lost her favorite button. She sat on a bench under a tree shaped like a heart. The cushion was warm, though no sun had touched it. It felt like the place itself remembered her. She could almost hear voices in the breeze, her grandmother calling her in for tea, the soft hum of lullabies from long ago. There was no sadness here, only gentle echoes. Nora's heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Not heavy, just peaceful. She took her time, touching the bark of old trees, smelling flowers that hadn't bloomed in decades, letting her fingers trail through tall grass that once reached her knees. She reached the end of the garden and found a weathered sign carved in smooth oak. It simply read, "Leave when your heart is ready. Return when it calls you back." Nora smiled softly. She turned, walked the path again, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. The lanterns dimmed behind her as she stepped back through the door. It closed without a sound. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the wooden floor of the cottage. It lit up the kitchen like a soft smile, catching dust motes in the air and warming the kettle just before it whistled. Nora stood by the sink, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, looking out toward the hill. The door in the ivy was quiet now, like it had always been. If not for the feeling in her chest, the calm that had settled in like an old friend, she might have thought it was all a dream. But she knew better. She moved through the cottage with new eyes. The photo on the mantel of her parents dancing barefoot in the garden seemed brighter. The teacup with the crack down one side felt like it had a story to tell. And in the attic where she hadn't ventured in years, something called to her. Climbing the narrow staircase, she ducked beneath old beams and brushed cobwebs from dusty boxes. The smell of cedar and old books greeted her like a memory. In the far corner, under a quilt her grandmother had stitched, was a wooden chest Nora didn't remember placing there. It was worn smooth by time, the latch easy to open. Inside, she found bundles of letters tied with ribbon, her mother's handwriting on envelopes, her own childish scribbles on the back of folded drawings. Each letter was a window, little pieces of love and life she'd forgotten. One was a note from her grandfather. Nora, remember to laugh loud and often. It keeps the apples sweet. Another from May. Let's never grow up, all right? But if we must, let's do it kindly. Nora sat cross-legged on the attic floor. The letters piled around her like petals. Her heart was steady and full. The garden behind the door had done something gently powerful. It hadn't changed her. It had reminded her of who she already was. She read every letter until the light in the attic dimmed. Then she carefully wrapped them again, not to hide them away, but to preserve them like a bouquet, something to return to, like the door itself. Downstairs she lit the fire and made 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one just in case for anyone who might knock. The garden door remained closed, but Nora no longer needed to open it. The past wasn't something to live in. It was something to carry forward. Spring arrived in a quiet burst of color. Snowdrops bowed their heads in the garden, and tiny buds peeked out from the tips of apple tree branches. The village awoke slowly, as if stretching from a long, restful sleep. Nora's cottage, with its ivy walls and warm windows, looked more alive than ever. She spent her mornings in the herb patch, humming songs she barely remembered learning. The robins had returned, perching confidently on the garden fence, waiting for crumbs and kind words. The world felt steady, familiar, and new all at once. Word had begun to spread through the village. Children whispered about the ivy-covered door. Elders smiled knowingly but said little. One by one, neighbors stopped by. Some brought pies or fresh milk. Others brought books or questions. They didn't ask directly about the door, but they stayed longer, lingered at the gate, eyes flicking toward the hill. Nora began to share her stories, softly and with love. She spoke of her grandfather's orchard and the way her mother used to laugh when flour dusted her nose. She shared little memories like garden seeds, planting them gently in the hearts of others. One day, a girl named Elsie visited. She was quiet, with wide eyes and dirt under her fingernails, a curious child who often wandered alone. She brought Nora a feather she had found, iridescent and strange. Nora smiled and offered her a cup of tea, chamomile with honey. "Have you ever walked into a memory?" Elsie asked. Nora thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, and it was the softest thing I've ever done." The child looked toward the hill. "Do you think it would open for me?" Nora smiled gently. "Maybe not today, but someday, when your heart is still and your feet are ready." From then on, Elsie visited every week. They planted marigolds together and painted stones with bright colors. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, just sat quietly in the sun. And one morning, when the air was especially sweet, Nora handed Elsie a little wooden bowl. Inside, it was a key, the same one that had always sat beside her fireplace. "I think it's time it belonged to someone new," she said. Elsie took it with both hands, her eyes full of wonder. Nora watched her skip off down the garden path, toward the hill. The ivy fluttered in the breeze. The door was still there, and always would be. Thank you so much for walking through this story with me. If it brought a little warmth to your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and come back for more cozy tales. Until next time, take gentle care and remember, some doors open not to escape the world, but to walk a little more deeply into it. Sripal.